everybody, and welcome to DynamicsCon. Let's get started with this session on how to get started with Power BI. My name is Belinda Allen. I am with Smith & Allen Consulting. I am a 10-year data platform Power BI, 5 years Power Platform and 5 years GP. And I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer. You could find me at all things at Ms. Belinda Allen. And I want to remind you to ask questions throughout this presentation. I have a lot of content and I will be live at the end, so you can ask me in person if you like. And before we begin, I want to give a very special thank you to the Dynamics user group. Everybody at Doug and DynamicsCon is fabulous. And how awesome is it that we get to attend this conference for free? So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start by looking at our agenda, and we're going to spend the bulk of our time focusing on components and the process, particularly the process. To get started in Power BI, you have to understand what the pieces are, where to get them, and which ones you're going to use when. And as part of that, we're going to choose picking our roles, and we have tons of demos throughout all of that. And then at the very end, I'm going to quickly run through some places that you could learn on your own and give you some tips for small Power BI implementations. And when I say small, I mean from 1 to 25 users. And then at the very end, I'll show you how you can get my demo files and copy of the slide deck. Now, before we start in on the components, we need to understand exactly what Power BI is and what it isn't. A lot of people think it's an app that you download. Well, that's part of it. Some people think it's just a website. Well, that's also part of it. And a lot of people just think of it as a dashboard, but it's so much more than that. There are connectors in Power BI so that you could use in the app that you download, so you could publish to the cloud. There are tools to help you clean your data and organize it so that you can report on it much more efficiently and in a much more user-friendly fashion. And then, of course, there are those dashboards. There are visuals, there are reports, and you can make them available wherever you work, whether it is at your desktop, whether it's home using your home PC, whether you're using a mobile app at a customer site, or even if you're working in Microsoft Teams, or you want to use a Halo to basically do a tour of a warehouse and see what your reports are in the warehouse. Tons of places to use all of these data. Now, as we start in looking at the components, the concept initially for the typical GP user, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on, is the Power BI desktop is something you download and you build your reports. You publish it to the cloud, powerbi.com, known as the Power BI service. And everything in the cloud you can consume on your mobile app. And that's the process that we go through. Now, let's talk about pricing, because depending on what license you have, there's going to be different components available. And again, we're focusing on the typical GP user. And that typical GP user is going to use the Pro version, which is $9.99 per user per month. Now, there's a free version as well. And the biggest difference between free and Pro is sharing. So if I build a report and I want you to use it and I'm going to share it with you, I need to have a Pro license. And if you want to use the report I'm sharing with you, you need a Pro license. And that's typically how it would work. Now, there is a scaled up version called Premium, and you can see the premium prices are very different. There is a premium per user for $20 a user per month. And again, the same concept would apply, that both people receiving and sharing would need to have the premium license. And this is a great way that Microsoft has made a lot of the really cool features of premium available for users. And then there's this per capacity, which is not something the typical GP user would use. There is a break-even point on it, because although you still need the $10 a month for designing reports in the premium per capacity, but all the people who use the reports get to use the free version. So there is a break-even point, but it's usually not the GP people. So we're going to focus on Pro for the purpose of today. So I want to show you a couple of the main differences between the two and what drives them. So I have the Pro highlighted in the blue column. One of the big differences between Pro and Premium, and I would recommend Premium per user if you want, but it's paginated reports. So there's a report builder that is pretty pretty much identical to the SQL Server Analysis Server Report Builder, but it's something that would enable you to create a printable or exportable report that has multiple pages to it. So if you wanted to have a really long age trial balance, you could, for example, using a paginated report. Another thing has to do with the data source size. If you have a really big data source, and Power BI does a lot of compression, but if a single data source exceeds 1 gigabyte, you're going to need to go into the premium per user. And again, it would take a lot of data for that to happen. And the refresh rates. In Power BI Pro, you can refresh your report in the cloud up to 8 times a day, but you could do it 48 times a day in premium. And the last thing I want to point out is the storage size. And this would include everything: reports, any Excel reports you upload, any Power BI reports, the data, and so forth. If you have 5 Power BI Pro users, you have 50 gigabytes of data that you can store your data in for your organization. If you find you need more than that, and again, serious compression going on, then you can move up to premium per user and get up to 1 terabyte. Now, I just wanted to explain all that because it's a really confusing issue about which version do I need, which version do I use. Now, if you go to the download area, this is where you would get the individual pieces that you would need to install or, well, basically download and install. So we're going to focus on the top row because the top row is for all licenses, not just premium. The bottom row are premium. It's the paginated report builder and a report server if you want to keep your reports local as opposed to keeping them in the cloud in the Power BI service. So if we start on the top right, we have a gateway. And because GP is in a SQL server, you're going to need to have a gateway installed somewhere on your network on a machine that's always on. That's how all the data in the cloud is going to be able to refresh with the data on your local GP, right, on your local SQL server. We're not going to be talking about the gateway today, but I will be happy to answer questions about the gateway for you. In the middle area is the mobile device that you could download, and you actually download those from the appropriate store. And there's even a mobile device for a PC. So if you don't want to use the browser, you want to use the mobile device because it is easier to use, then you could also get that from the store. But I want to point out the desktop area. This is something you're going to need to use and you're going to want to use. There are features in the desktop that are not available in the service as far as data modeling. You could do some data modeling in the service, but for the most part, you're going to want to do everything that you can in the desktop because you get so much more capabilities in cleansing and organizing your data. Now, there are 2 options for download, and it's important I talk about this so you understand. If you clicked on the download option, you're going to go to the Microsoft Store, and you're going to be downloading it from the store. And this is the preferred method for 2 reasons. 1, it does not require local admin rights to install, and number 2, there's a new version every month. It'll automatically install the new version for you. If you do not have access to the store, then you could go to the advanced download options and download it and install it. But you do need local admin rights, and you will need to download it every month and install it. So if you have 4 people sharing it in the company, all 4 people are going to have to install it every month, because if you want to just share the file of the local Power BI desktop file, then they need to be on the same version that you're on. So all this is real important to understand so that we know what we're talking about. So at this point, or we know what we're doing, what pieces we're using in the data modeling. So here we have this visual of what the typical GP implementation would use. So we're going to start with the desktop here, which again is something that you would need to download. So let's take a quick tour of the desktop. This is what the Power BI desktop looks like. So if we start at the number 1, we have a menu and a ribbon. And on the ribbon, you could perform certain actions and tasks on your data or your visuals or whatever you want to do. Very similar to all other Microsoft Office applications like Outlook. Number 2 indicates the canvas. Now the canvas can contain different views. So if we were to click on where the purple arrow is pointing, this is the report view. And in the report view, we would actually see the visuals. We would see what the report looks like. A lot of people call it a dashboard because it has visuals on it, charts and graphs and so forth. but a dashboard is something different entirely. This is a report. And so the yellow arrow is pointing to the data model. So if I want to see the data that's been imported into my Power BI desktop report, I could click on the yellow area. The green arrow is pointing to the data modeling, and this is where I create relationships and do a little bit other data modeling to the final touches of my data modeling, if you will. Item number 3 is pointing to different pages on the report. This is very similar to an Excel file where you have different worksheets. So you could have multiple report pages on a single report, and with this, you would just have all the tabs going across the bottom. Then over on the right, we have blades or panes. So blade number 4 is the visualization pane. This is where we control which kind of visualization is being used, which fields are used in it, and how it's formatted, including the formatting of things like the background of the page altogether. And page number 5 is where we have connections to all of our queries or tables. So depending on where you're working, you're either going to call it a query or a table. And all the fields or columns that are associated in that query. So that's just a little quick and dirty tour of the desktop. So let's go through and take a look at the demo. And again, if you know before, I frequently record my demos so I stay focused, and that's what I'm doing here. So if I were to select sales in my query list, it's automatically going to create a clustered column chart because it's a numerical value. So I have my sales in, and now I'm going to put the product in the axis by just inserting it in the blade for visualization, and now I have a visual. If I click anywhere in the white space, I can start another one. Now, country has been categorized as geography, so it automatically connected to Bing Maps, and it created a map for me. And notice now I have this interaction occurring between my map and my clustered column chart. Now you could pick a visual off the chart. So here I'm picking the clustered column chart with a line running through it. And I'm going to put in my sales, and I'm going to put in my profit. And I'm going to put these columns in, these values in side by side. So I have 2 columns in each area. But I'm also going to go through and put segments in for my column so I can compare all of the segments together. And then I'm going to create the units sold, a number of units sold as the line. And it has a different numbering scheme, but I could do some comparisons that way. And then finally here, well, not finally, but I'm putting in a slicer as well. So this gives me some additional flexibility when I'm trying to create some interaction for my report. So what I'm putting in here is the year and the month. And when I do this now, I can go through and select a month in any given year, and my report will completely change to reflect that particular month. Now here's the finally. I'm going to select a text field, and then it creates the visual by default of a table. And this is a lot like an Excel table. So I've got in my product, I'm going to put in my sales, and I'm going to create a discount column as well. So these are all my values on my table. But if I want to separate my sales and discount by year, I need to change it to a matrix, which is a lot like a pivot table in Excel. And now I have that all set up nice and neat where I could do year by year comparisons. I could even put some fields in the filter blade, so I can filter the whole report or just this page or just a single visual by selecting it in the filter pane. Now I have this wonderful interactive report that I can learn a little bit more about my data. Let's go through and talk about the process now. So this is what you're going to want to do when you build a report out, pretty much with no exception. You want to access the data, you're going to clean it, you're going to potentially mash it up, which is also part of the cleanup in my opinion. Then you're going to want to explore the data, and that includes adding in some additional pieces as well. We'll talk about what those are. Then you'll create your visuals on your report, and then you'll share the report. Now, everything all the way to the visualization is called data modeling. And if you're not spending the bulk of your time in data modeling, then your report is probably not as efficient as it should be. It's probably not as user-friendly as it should be, and it's probably not able to take advantage of a lot of the built-in AI. So we want to make sure that you spend the appropriate amount of time in the data modeling process. So let's start by accessing our data. Now, going back to this chart, you can access from one or multiple data sources. It doesn't matter. We can mash them up together. That's what the mashup is about. But what we're going to do is connect to SQL Server. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm in the desktop. I click on Get Data, but you also notice I could just click on SQL Server right away. Now, by clicking on Get Data, I can see all of those connectors I talked about that were part of Power BI. There are a lot of pre-built connectors. Some go directly into Power BI data sources that have already been built, and some are generic, like the ability to get ODBC or a web link. Some are Excel, but we want to go to the one that is specifically for SQL Server. So this is a database one. And once I select this, it's going to prompt me to enter in which SQL Server I want to connect to and which database I want to connect to. And once I key this in, if I wanted to, I could enter in T-SQL code by opening up the advanced options and just writing in the T-SQL or pasting it in, and I would automatically be using that T-SQL to connect to my data. But I want to get the whole list, so I'm going to click on OK. Now, if you haven't logged in before, it's going to prompt you for credentials, but it remembers mine. So now I'm going to see the list of all of the views, tables, and stored procedures that are in this database. And I'm going to use the vendor one, which is out of the box one. And this is very similar to a smart list inside of GP, but it includes all the columns. So I see this preview on the right. That's the one I want, so I'll check the box. And I'm also going to get the payables transaction. And again, I'm going to get a preview on the right. Here there are so many columns, you can only see row number 1, but that's okay. That's the data I want, so I'm going to go ahead and select that as well. Again, it's out of the box. Now I could load it directly into Power BI, but if I click on Transform, it's going to open up one of those tools I talked about, which is the Power Query Editor, which is incredibly powerful. Yes, pun intended. The advantage of learning to use Power Query Editor is that it's also in Excel and it's in some of the other Power Platform tools as well. So it's learning one thing and being able to use it in multiple places. Now, as we continue through the Power BI process, now that we have our data connected to the Power Query Editor, it's time to start cleaning the data. So let's go ahead and do that. And you notice that the Query Editor is kind of wedged in here between the data and the Power BI desktop. Because even though we've connected to it, we haven't actually loaded the data into the Power BI desktop file yet. We've only made the connection. But quick, let's do a tour of the Power Query Editor. Again, where the number 1 is, we have a menu and a toolbar. Number 2, we have a blade on the left that shows all the queries or tables that are connected in this data set. So even though we have 2 separate queries, together these make up one single data set. One data set file that gets published with all of our data modeling. Number 3, we can see the data, or at least an image of the first 1,000 records of the data, if there are more than 1,000, for whichever query we have selected. And then on the right, number 4, we have a properties pane for that query. And the important thing on the properties pane is the supplied steps. So everything I do inside of Power BI or Power Query Editor is going to be recorded in these applied steps so that I have repeatability. By refreshing data, it'll run through all the steps for me and I don't have to manually make changes to it each and every time. So let's take a tour of the Query Editor. Now, I started this video in Power BI, so I clicked on Transform Data to get here. And the first thing I like to do, I have what I call Belinda's 3 rules, is rename the query. And you could right mouse click and rename it, or go to the properties on the right and rename it. And my suggestion is rename it to something that makes sense for the end users, right? So we want to make this as easy for them as possible. So all column names and all queries should be named for users. Now, the second thing I like to do, which was hidden in the page turn, was remove any unnecessary columns. And we'll take a look at that in a moment. But the third thing that I do, and this is critical, is we want to make sure the data type for each column is correct. And change it like I'm doing for the date, time, making it date here. And you notice where the red arrow is, I can see the data type as well on the tool, on the toolbar at the top. But it's important that we set the data type because that's going to determine how this field or column works. Now here I'm opening up that choose columns where I narrowed it down, and I'm going back in and adding in the due date so you can see how that works. Then I go back to the last step and I can continue on my process. So I'm going to go back and change the due date to date time as well. Or rather from date time to date. You never want to have date time in a column. If you do track time, you want to separate those out into two separate columns. Power BI runs better that way. Now, I want to do a little bit more cleansing of my data. I don't want any history. This is open payables. So I'm going to go to the document status and just use filters just like in Excel and unmark history, leaving posted and unposted open, although I could remove unposted as well if I wanted to. And now that I've got that done, I have this new applied step. And once I start doing data cleansing beyond changing the data types and renaming things, I like to go in and right mouse click and rename each step so I know exactly what it's doing. So now I'm telling it I'm filtering out history. Now I also have voids. I want to get rid of any voids. That is, we know that voids get stored in our database, so I want to account for that. So I'm going to choose the drop-down list, and I don't see any voided transactions here. So I'm going to manually account for that by clicking on text filter and saying text filter where the voids does not equal, and then I'll type in yes. So I'm only left with nulls, which are unposted, and no's, which are posted transactions that are not voided. And now after I rename this, I could go through and remove this particular column because I no longer need it. So long as the step to remove this column is after the filter, then it served its purpose and I no longer need it. So I just right mouse click on it and remove the column. And now basically I have a nice cleaned data model that I could use to update my data. Now, I also will frequently go through and rename everything so that it makes a little more sense for everybody, but I'm not going to do that right now because there's a lot that we can do. And once I click on load and apply, or close and apply, it closes out the query editor and it applies all of that updated, clean data into the Power BI data model. So all that data is cached and condensed inside the data model. So now it's technically part of Power BI. Now here's another demo where I'm going to keep working on some things. This time I realize that just like in Smart List, credits, returns, and payments show up as positive, and I want to make sure those are negative. So I'm going back and adding the column for Dynamics type integer. In GP, you could change the field name so it's not credit memos, it's credits or whatever. So we don't want to go by the name. Going by the integer is a safer bet. And then now I'm taking that current amount column and I'm adding a new column by multiplying the current amount times -1. Now I have a positive and a negative column for every row that's out there. And now what I can do is create a conditional column, which is what I'm doing here, that will decide which column to use for the value based on the integer. So in this particular case, I know 1, 2, and 3 should be positive numbers. So I'll say if the document integer type is less than or equal to 3, those are the positive ones, then I'm going to select the data from the column current transaction amount. I also happen to know that 7 is scheduled payment, which should also be positive. So I'm going to say if it integer equals 7, then also get it from the current transaction type amount rather. And then if it doesn't meet those criteria, it must be negative. So the else is going to pull from the column called multiplication, which is the column I created by multiplying the current transaction amount by -1. And now I have this new amount due column that is negative when it needs to be negative and positive when it needs to be positive. And now I can highlight the 3 columns I used to create that one and right mouse click and remove those columns because they now have served their purpose. So now I have all the columns that I need in a nice organized method. Now you could even go a step further by taking the due date and aging it to today and creating an aging bucket if you want to, or connecting to the aging buckets inside of Power BI or GP if you want to. So you've got a couple different varieties there. Now there's even more cleansing that we can do of the data. So here is this is just fake and made up. I made up this Excel spreadsheet, and across the top in my table here, I have my vendor classes. And then for under each one, I have the rating for pay, how they pay, and who in our company is the payables manager. So what I'm going to do here on this is I'm going to import this Excel table in because I want to use this connection information in as part of my data model. So there we go. So now the data's already in this demo, already in. Again, the first thing I want to do is rename this query to something that makes sense. Table 2 does not make sense. So now that I'm looking at my data, I realize that all of my vendor IDs are in as headers, and I need to be able to access those so I can create relationships. So I have to get them out of the headers. So what I'm going to do, on the home ribbon, there's an option called use first row as headers. And if I click on that drop-down list, I can now say use headers as first row. And by doing that, it has now dropped those down into the first row of my data. And now I could take advantage of transposing the whole table. So I'm going to go to transform and click on transpose, and it flipped it. So now I have one column for all of my vendor classes, and I have the other related columns for each class. And now my headers are the first row, so I'm going to go back to that same place in the ribbon and this time move the rows up to headers. And now I have my data. And you'll notice that the data type got set for those automatically. And that was because Power BI looked at the data and it said, hey, this looks like it's a numerical decimal and this looks text. Now I just want to change the column name for this vendor class. So I'll just double click on the column name. And now I have a vendor class ID. And that's basically how we can use this data to clean up. So let's move on. I want to point out, though, there are a ton of things that you can do in the query editor. There's so much more than I can show you now. We could spend a couple days on it. But you could split things, you can merge things, you can create brand new columns by examples, you could pivot, you could unpivot other columns or unpivot selected columns and fill, and it just goes on and on. So let's move down to the mashup area. So we're going to come back in to our demo here. Now I have this table that we just created. And if I do a relationship right now, forgive my crude drawing with my mouse, I have the vendor class detail table, which I would have to connect to the vendor table, which I would have to connect to the payables transaction table. And this breaks the star schema. This is not the way a star schema should look. I've got that vendor class and the vendor table. There's no reason they can't be combined as a single table. So that's what I'm going to do now. So what I'll do is I'll go to the vendor table, and now from the ribbon, I'm going to choose merge queries because I'm going to merge in that rating and the manager into the vendor table. So I'll select the vendor class table and I'll use vendor class ID as the relationship for both of those. Now you can only create it with one field. And because I have the Excel file, it's asking me about the privacy level. It's all controlled with permissions, so I'm going to say just ignore that. Perhaps I have the Excel file in my OneDrive anyhow, so it's secure there. And once I combine them, I get this new column with table in as the value. If I click on the double-headed arrow or the expand, I can see all the fields. I'll uncheck that last option because I don't want rating to be called vendor class details.rating. So I'll just want rating. And then I'm going to unmark the vendor class ID because I don't need to have that column twice. And now I have two new columns, one for rating and one for the program manager. And it brought the data type with it. Now, it also brought in nulls for wherever there wasn't a vendor class ID. And you want to get rid of nulls because nulls can create problems with some visuals. So I just right mouse click, find and replace. I replace the rating null with 0 and the payables manager null with unknown. And now I have all of that set up. The last thing I'm going to do, if I bring in this data from the vendor class into my data model, it's going to be duplicated. So in the query pane on the left, I'm going to right mouse click and I'm going to uncheck enable load. It will leave the include in report refresh checked. So every time I refresh my data, it's going to refresh this data from my Excel file, and then it'll merge it in, but it's not going to bring it into my Power BI file. All right. So that's a little bit about Mashup. Let's talk a little bit about exploring data. So first of all, I want you to know that everything you do in the query editor, everything that you do from the ribbon is actually being written. Everything in the applied steps is being written in a language called M. And I want to show you how you could see that. So if you select like the vendor query where the number 1 is, and I just added in some groups in my sample file so I could organize my data tables or my fact tables with my lookup tables or my dimension tables. We'll talk more about that in a moment. And once you highlight one there, if you go up to where the number 2 is, on the menu bar and choose View, then you go to number 3 and click on Advanced Editor. Then a pop-up window will appear and it shows you the M code that was used in all of those applied steps, and it actually writes that for you. And so again, that is the M code. So whenever you're learning and you see people talking about M, this is exactly what they're talking about. The only thing you really need to know about M, if you write everything using the ribbon that you can, which is the recommended way anyhow, is each row, like row number 5, references the row before it. That's how it knows. So row number 4 is called pound remove other columns. And if I look in row number 5, I can see that. So that's the most important thing you want to know. In Power BI Desktop, not the query editor, there is another language as well called DAX, and this is something you're definitely going to want to learn. DAX stands for Data Analysis Expressions. It is also used in a few other places as well, like Power Pivot, and it seems like one other place right now that it's escaping me. I think SQL Server Analysis Server. But it creates 3 different things. First of all, in red, you can add additional columns to your data. Like I just added a long string for the vendor city, comma, space, state, space, space, zip code. In purple, it creates tables. So this is my calendar table, so I can create date hierarchies. Our time intelligence fields like month to date, year to date, same period last year, year over year, percent change, and so forth. And this is the script I wrote in DAX to give me those fields. And then in yellow, we have measures. The measures are just formulas that get used when you use a visual. And this is where you would put something in like of all of my accounts payable, what percent is this particular vendor of all of my accounts payable? So there are some things you could do with measures that are incredibly powerful. And then finally, the last part of exploring the data has to do with relationships. And this is a star schema, which is the preferred method. And I do have a link on how you can learn more about star schemas at the end. But what I've done when I've created my relationship in Power BI is I've just collapsed it up. So I'm only seeing the fields where the relationships are connected. So vendor ID to vendor ID. And you'll notice that there's a 1 and an asterisk. So I have a one-to-many relationship. The vendor will only exist one time in this table and many times here. And same with the calendar date and the document date. And then I've hidden the document date and the vendor ID from this payables, this open payable. So users will have to select it up here. Now this is called a star schema because this is my fact table or my data table. This is actually what I'm measuring, the open payables, where the vendors and the calendar or are lookup tables or dimension tables. And this star happens to only have 2 points. It could even have 1 point and still be a star schema, but this is the way you want to create your data when you start laying out all of your data sets, because you're going to get much better performance. And again, I'll share that with you at the tips at the end. So let's dig into visualization now. So in visualization, I'm going to go through and add in a couple of visuals here. Now, I mentioned AI being built in, and one of the AI that's included is something called Q&A, which is natural language query. It's been out there pretty much since version 1, not always in the desktop. It was always in the cloud. And all I'm doing is I added one Q&A visual, and now I'm copying and pasting. So I'm having a whole page of 4 Q&A visuals on here. Now, it is using artificial intelligence, and it's reading the data and doing analysis on the data, and it's coming up with suggested questions for you. Now, if you don't like these questions or you don't think your users would want to ask them, you can replace them with your own questions if you like. That makes it nice and easy. But this is a way for users to kind of create their own custom report in a very light way. Now, they don't have to select those questions. So you notice here where it says balance by city, I'm going to remove city and change it to vendor class. So I'm looking at balance by vendor class, and the visual will change accordingly. You also notice some of the fields are blue and underlined blue, and that is where it's connecting to data points. So here I'm writing, what is the maximum balance and vendor name? And now I could see which vendor has the highest balance, and there it is. So you can create some of your own visuals here. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so I want to also show you one more AI tool that's pretty cool. And this is called the decomp tree. And the decomp tree kind of helps you answer the question of what do I look for when I don't know what I want to look for, right? Anytime you see the light bulb like this in a visual, you know AI is at play. So you're going to put in a numerical field usually that you want to analyze. Now, if you're looking at sales, you could look growth, year-over-year growth, and that's a great way to figure out why your sales are growing. In this case, I'm looking at the balance of my AP, and I don't know how I want to analyze it, so I'm just throwing in every possible thing that might explain where balances are high. So I'm putting in some geography, the vendor class ID, the vendor name, who posted it, and even some date fields like year and month and quarter. And I'm throwing everything I can, everything in the kitchen sink in the explain by. And now I could see the balance that I want to analyze, and I could choose any one of those options and see the breakdown of them as they're included. But here's where the AI comes in. If you click on that plus, you can see the high value and the low value have light bulbs. If you select high value, you're saying, okay, of everything in the explain by category, what has the biggest weighted factor in making this a high balance? And you could keep going down the list, and you could actually analyze your data without being an analyst and figure out what the heck is going on with it. So now that I have all of this data analyzed, you can see the blue line that runs through and explains what all of the main factors are. But at any point in this diagram, if I select a different option, the whole report could likely change. Not only the values, but the columns can shift around because the weighted, or the thing with the most weight might change. You could even put filters in the filter pane if you want, so you can even narrow down how you're doing analysis. This is an awesome, awesome tool, and it's one I recommend that everybody learn to play with very, very quickly. It's really simple to use. Okay, so now let's dig in and start building out what we think of when we think of a report. So I'm going to go through and just add in a matrix here. And in the matrix, it's kind of, actually the matrix is probably my favorite visual. It looks more like a pivot table, but you could put a lot of valuable information in there and get a lot of good detail. So I'm going to put in quite a few rows inside of this visual, and then put some values out there and even put some columns out there like we saw before. Now, I want to make this a little more user-friendly, so I'm going to do a little bit more work to it. So I'm going to go into the row headers and open up the stepped area, which is under options. And what this is going to do is enable me to go back and forth from an outline view to a tabular view. So I'm going to drill down to all of the different rows that are out there. And right now we have what we call a tabular view. So we have a new column or a column appear for everything that's listed in the rows. If I turn that back off, this is the outline view. So I prefer the tabular view. It does take up more space, but it's easy to see. And now that I'm looking at it this way, I have all of these different subtotals, and that makes me absolutely crazy. So I'm going in and turning on a subtotal per row level, and I'm going to turn off for everything other than the vendor ID, other than the top level. So I'm going to painstakingly go through. Now you have to drill all the way down first before you do this. Otherwise you won't see everything. And now I only have the total for each line and not with every subtotal. So it's much easier to see the data. Now, sometimes visuals or formatting has to do with more than just looking pretty. I'm going to put a border around this because it's going to make it easier on the eye to see where this visual begins and where this visual ends. Now I'm going to add another visual here. I'm going to add in a clustered bar chart. And this is the same as the columnar chart, except it goes up and down. And I'm going to look at the balance by vendor class in this particular mode. Now, Again, I want to put a border around it. So I'll just search for border this time and put the border around it. But now I have this interactive report where I could select a particular vendor class and it'll update. Nowhere on here do I have the balance, the grand total balance. So I'm going to go to my title, which is just text, and I could use something called Smart Narratives, which is a Q&A field, to populate the total value right in my title. So I can make this a valuable visual as well. And I'm just going to format it so it's the same height. Now watch what happens when I use the interactive experience. If I select one particular class, the title is going to change to show me the dollar value for that. So there are so many cool things you can do that are incredibly valuable for you as you start analyzing your data. Now that we have visualized our data, it's time to share it. And sharing is quite simple. In the desktop, you're going to go in and publish it. And publishing it you have to be logged in using your Power BI account or your Office 365 account. That'll publish it to the server. You choose which workspace you want, and then it's published. So at that point, when you go in the cloud to share it, I recommend creating a Power BI app, and you'll see the number 1. There's a tab for permissions where you could share it with the whole group for Office 365 or individuals. And you can even give them underlying permission to the data set and the ability to share that data set. Now, here are all the roles, typical roles, although they could be filled by one person or many people. The items in green tend to be more on the developer side of Power BI. And by developer, it could be citizen developer. It doesn't have to be pro developer. Data analyst will be the one who's creating the visuals to create them in a meaningful fashion, and then someone to share the report with end users. This brings us to where to learn. I'll put all of these in there, but there is a Skill Up class, which is part of Dynamics User Group. For only $25, it is using BC as the foundation data, but at least you understand the Power BI concepts. Number 2 is information from Microsoft about the star schema. Number 3 is the Power Platform or the Power BI, which includes Power Query. And then number 4 is also learning information from Microsoft about DAX. Some tips I want to share with you. Because your data is SQL, go ahead and create the SQL views rather than cleaning it up. It'll make refreshing data a lot faster. So instead of getting 9,000 columns, which seems like it, some of them are like 300, really, seriously, like the payables transaction, you can narrow down to just the columns you need and do a lot of the modeling there. That's going to be a lot faster. Use names that make sense to end users. If you think you don't need a column, get rid of it. It's too easy to go back. Put spaces in column names and query names because that's going to make more sense for users. Verify your data types. Make sure you replace all null values. Get rid of duplicates in your data model. Publish your data all by itself to Power BI, and then go and create a new Power BI report for the visuals connecting to that data. Then if you have a change, you only make it one spot, and every report that uses it will have the updated changes. Again, I pointed out, this is really important to me, obviously, SQL Server, put in a custom SQL Server view, create a template of your Power BI file, and use some external tools to document your Power BI file, use parameters if you can for database names. And then finally on relationships, only use one-to-many or many-to-one. Do not use many-to-many. You'll end up making yourself crazy. And only make sure that they're single directional relationships, not bidirectional. You'll really go crazy if you try to do bidirectional relationships. And there's no reason why anything you want in Power BI can't be used by both of those. I want to thank everybody for attending. I know there was a lot of information, but I do have a few minutes for questions. And again, thanks one more time to Dynamics User Group for putting on this particular conference. Here is where you can get more information, bit.ly, more from Belinda. It is case sensitive, and there's my YouTube channel. And here's the link here, and you can get a copy of the slide deck by going to that file as well, and maybe some other goodies I have to share. So let's go in and dive into that Q&A.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. Thank you for let me put you on the screen where I could see you. Thanks for joining me today. We have a lot to talk about and not a lot of time to get it in. So
Yeah. So,
I
um,
cheated
I,
everyone on Q&A, so I will be in the chat room or in the breakout room later. Okay, go ahead.
yeah. So you were trying to answer as many as you could typing. So, one of the ones that I noticed that stood out was Alexander Stark. Hopefully, I say that right. That they were asking about using GP with Dataverse
Yes,
sources and how to modify that and the format and all that.
yes,
Did you see
yeah.
that question?
So yeah, Power BI. So Power
Yeah.
BI with Dataverse. Dataverse is one of the Power Platform products. For those of you who are not aware of it, it is a database inside of Power Apps, and you could use a light version of it in Teams to build Power Apps, and it's very, very cool. And honestly, I was a little hesitant with Dataverse when it was called Common Data Model. And then the more I played in it, the more I absolutely fell in love with it. And so, for a variety of reasons, I haven't played with it too much with GP data, but yes, there is some native functionality or built in connectors with Dataverse, and you could do a lot with it. And I noticed that you also asked the question about the data isn't really user friendly in maybe the column names, for
Yeah.
example. And that's something, it's all about user adoption, right? You got to make it easy for the end users. This isn't Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. You have to make it easy for people so that they could feel the benefit and the value from it, not just be told that it's there. So you definitely want to make things easy for the end user. Make the naming convention easy. That's that's rule number one of Belinda's 3 rules. So yeah.
Yeah. So you were doing, one of the people asked when you build the data model, and then someone said, does it go through all those applied steps? So for this person with the Dataverse, if you renamed them, then when you pulled it, it would rename it every time for them to make it easy, right?
Yeah, so those applied steps, that is what your data is going to do every time the Power BI report refreshes to the data. Now, because of the limited time, and this was a beginner how to get started course, once you publish this into the cloud, in the cloud, it can connect to a gateway on your network and get to your GP data, or if your data that you're writing the report on happens to already be in the cloud, then you don't even need to worry about a data gateway. But the report itself and that data model itself is in the Power BI service. So every time that you refresh it, and that's where you could set up automatic refreshes up to 8 times a day, although you can manually refresh it as much as you want, or use Power Automate to create refreshes for you beyond those 8 times. So there's multiple ways, but it goes
Okay.
all of those links into it. Yeah.
Okay. Somebody asked, the person asked for the link to the slide deck in the chat there. I know you put up that in your slides, you had the QR, but if you have a link to it, if you want to put it in the chat, they'll grab it there.
Yeah, that's a little, I don't know that I have it in the chat. If you come to the chat session afterwards, actually at the very, I could share with you my, where you can get more info. Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
do
okay.
that real
We'll put
quick.
it back in there. Okay. Now we only have about 2 minutes. So there was a question on the how much embedded PBI is different than PBI desktop. So is
Okay.
that
Yeah, so embedded PBI is actually a visual or a report that gets embedded inside of a website or an application. The desktop is basically, I guess some people probably use it as a reporting tool, but essentially the desktop is meant for designing and developing. And
okay?
so that's primarily, in short answer, the difference between the two.
Okay. And somebody asked about using embedded PBI in 365 F&O. If they can jump over to the GP breakout room, I think that would be a good place to talk about using it
Yeah,
for something else.
absolutely. And yes,
Okay.
same rules apply. It's cloud-based, obviously, so you have connectors built in, and there's a lot you could do with F&O,
Okay.
a lot.
Perfect. So
Yeah.
they're going to cut us off in probably like 25 seconds. So do you want to say goodbye and tell people on the side that says breakout rooms? And if you click that, there's a GP one. That's where you'll be, right?
Yeah, thank you guys for coming to the session today, and thanks our sponsors, and thank you DynamicsCon, and thank you to my very lovely and dear friend for being my moderator.